what do I mean by dissecting arguments? Well, I think of it as taking apart every single statement in a logical reasoning stimulus and being able to understand the role that each of those statements plays. And I think this is a really underrated skill because when I work with a lot of students, a lot of times they pause a little bit, they have some hesitancy when identifying what the conclusion of the argument is. There's a little bit of uncertainty with what the premise of the argument is, or if something is an intermediate conclusion. And also a lot of students, they don't seem to classify the other parts of an argument. So, you know how a lot of logical reasoning stimuluses start off with someone else's viewpoint, or they may start off with some background information. Sometimes students will just start thinking about everything besides a conclusion as a premise or support. And that is actually not correct. And if you start being able to actually see every single statement in its true role, it really helps you not only on main conclusion and role questions, but also just throughout logical reasoning. All right. So what I want to do is I want to start with the two items that you see on the screen here. This should probably be review. So, I might go pretty quickly through them, but if something I'm saying is a little bit confusing or you had some questions about some of the tips that I'm giving you or some of the definitions that I'm using, feel free to let me know either in the chat or you could also unmute yourself. All right. And then after that, after we go through these two items, we'll take a look at some pretty complicated examples, I think, that I've written myself, as well as some real LSAT problems. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. So what are the common pieces of an argument-based stimulus? Well, I think of it as falling into two different categories. One category is stuff that is part of the author's argument, meaning it's within the logic of the author's argument. This is the core of their argument. And then the rest of it is actually not part of the author's argument. So what do we mean by part of the author's argument? Well, as you probably know, that means premise and conclusion. All right. So the premise is a statement that the author is using to help prove another statement. All right. The premise is like the reason for the conclusion. And remember, what makes something a premise is not just that it provides support to the conclusion, but that it has no support of its own. So if you're thinking about whether something is a premise, you should be able to say, the author does not give me a reason to actually believe that this premise is true. The author is just asserting that it is true. All right? Because if the author does give you a reason to think that that premise is true, or what you think is a premise is true, then what you might be dealing with is a situation where you have an intermediate conclusion. And the intermediate conclusion, it may be supported by another statement, but then that will go on to support the main conclusion. All right. So I hope that's a little bit of review, and we'll definitely get into how to distinguish a little bit better between different kinds of conclusions, as well as how to distinguish between premises and conclusions in a moment. But make sure you understand the definitions of all of these. Premise does not have support, goes on to support something else. Intermediate or subsidiary conclusion, it does have support of its own, but it also supports something else. And the main conclusion is something that is supported by other things, but it does not go on to help prove or establish something else. All right. So that's the most important part of a logical reasoning stimulus. But let's talk about things that are not part of the author's argument. And broadly speaking, I think it falls into these categories. First, we have another person's view. So you know how a lot of logical reasoning stimuluses, they start off with what other people think, and then what does the author do? Usually the author rejects what those other people think. Not all the time, so don't assume that they're disagreeing with the conclusion necessarily. But oftentimes they are disagreeing with the conclusion, or maybe disagreeing with an assumption that the first person makes. Maybe they're disagreeing with the first person's premise as well. Sometimes the author actually ends up agreeing, but then maybe adding something to the other person's view. Now, within other person's view or other people's view, sometimes you do have to distinguish between the other person's premise and the other person's conclusion, all right? So just make sure you're ready to do that if you see that there is a premise-conclusion structure in the other person's view. Sometimes if you don't do that, it's going to be very difficult to spot certain flaws in the argument. Many flaws actually relate to how the author is responding to the other person's premise to conclusion jump. And if you just blur the distinction, if you just think of it all as this is what the other person said, then it's a lot harder, I think, to notice how the author is responding to the other person's argument. Another category, background information. And that I think of as falling mainly into two different categories. The thing that the argument is about, and also an observation or fact to be explained. So the thing that the argument is about, that is just referring to how some logical reasoning stimulus is. In the first sentence, they'll just introduce the topic, right? So it might say, recently a Chinese-Peruvian fusion restaurant opened nearby. And then the rest of it might be arguments about whether we should go or whether we should not go. The fact that a restaurant opened nearby, that's not a premise because that's not offered to help prove that you should go. It's just the thing that the argument is talking about. All right. And so we'll see some examples of that today. What's actually a lot more important to recognize, though, when it comes to background information is observation or fact to be explained. Sometimes people think of it as a phenomenon that needs to be explained. And what that refers to is a stimulus where you start off with something that is like an observation about the world. There's a lot more birds flying south this winter. A lot more teenagers are starting to use TikTok. And then the argument then goes into trying to provide an explanation for why that fact is true. So if you see that structure, then there's certain ways to weaken that kind of argument. There's certain things to look out for on that kind of argument. And we'll get into that when we see that in an example. All right. So these are the two big categories for background information. Not the only thing. All right. So if you feel like there's some other type of statement that's doesn't really play a logical role in the argument, then, there are other roles out there within background information. So the last big category of things that are outside of the logic of the author's argument is a concession. And can I ask you, what is a concession? Feel free to type in the chat, think a little bit about that, because I think it is important to have an understanding of what a concession is. And can you also think about what words are often signals of the author conceding a point to someone else? So Rain is saying agreeing a little bit only. Yeah, there's a little bit of agreement. Any other takes on what a concession is? So basically a concession is like the author bringing up a point that might seem to go against their own argument, but then the author is saying, actually though, I'm still right? So if I say, I deserve a raise because even though I'm always late, I do the best work. So do you see how I deserve a raise would be the conclusion? I do the best work is the actual reason I'm offering to prove the conclusion. But when I say even though I'm always late, that's definitely not a premise, because that doesn't help me prove my conclusion. It's a concession. I'm conceding that someone might think I don't deserve a raise because I'm always late. But anyway, here's the reason I deserve a raise. All right. So this is really important to recognize. Often introduced by although, despite. Sometimes you know that you're about to get a concession when they start off with, it is true that, right? It is true that I'm always late. But anyway, here's what I actually want to talk about. Okay, so that's a really important part of a stimulus if it's there. So the most important issue, though, after you get past those basic definitions, is how do we actually identify supporting statements and conclusions reliably, right? And there's a couple of ways to do that. So I think this should be review. So, when I have these categories up here, make sure you take a moment to think, what do I mean by the structure indicators, right? So the first way to identify what a premise or a conclusion is are certain indicator words. And you could think of them as falling into two categories: support indicators and conclusion indicators. So can you think a little bit, before I reveal it, what are the support indicators on the LSAT? The things that will tell you this is a reason being offered for something else. So we have, what's probably the most common? Since. Okay, what else? Because, yeah, those are the big ones. Now there's two more that are actually very common, although you don't really use them that often in real life. So we have for is the one, right? For is just like since, or it's not always like since, but it can be used like since. And honestly, no one really uses it in real life, right? I'm not saying I deserve a raise for I do the best work. That just sounds weird, but it is a premise or support indicator. After all is another guaranteed support indicator. All right. When you see after all, then you know the thing right before that word, that phrase, is being supported by the stuff after all. And then also I see given that, the phrase given that, that's another one that I think of as a premise or support indicator. Now, I do want to be careful here. I see the word so as an indicator. We'll get to that when it comes to conclusion indicators. So is a conclusion indicator. However, we'll talk about that in a moment, but words like however and but, they actually are not logically structure indicators. They don't actually give meaning to the sentence. They are good signals for where the author's opinion starts to come in, but they don't actually, by their very presence, tell you that something is support or conclusion. And these words I put up here, it's not exhaustive, but these words I put up here, although some of them can be used in other ways, when they are being used in their structural way, they're to indicate what the relationship between sentences is. These actually impart logical meaning to the statement. So when I see since X is true, comma, Y, it doesn't matter what X and Y actually mean. The mere presence of since is now telling me that X is a support for Y. Okay? So that's what I mean by structure indicators. What are the conclusion indicators? These ones are probably a little bit more available to you, right? Thus and therefore, hence, and so. These, like I was saying with the other structure indicator words, by their very presence, they do impart logical meaning to the statement that they're referring to or attached to. They will say this has support from something else. All right. Now, I think dividing these into the support and conclusion categories, it's a little bit misleading because all of these words actually tell you what is support and conclusion. Because when you have the word thus, for example, the thing after the thus would be a conclusion, but then you know that at least the part right before it, the line before it, would also be a statement of support. And then similarly, when you have the phrase for, well, the part attached to the for would be a support, but then the other part of the sentence would be a conclusion. Or if the word for begins its whole sentence and stands on its own, then the line right before the for would be a conclusion. All right. So we'll look at some examples of all of this. You don't need to memorize all those things. Okay. What's another way to identify what is a conclusion and a premise? This is probably the most important way to do it because you don't always get those structure indicator words, right? We can test the logical flow of the statements. And basically here are two examples of how to do that. If you are considering whether X supports Y or whether Y supports X, you can ask, why should I believe X? Because Y is true. If that makes sense to you, then that's probably the right structure, right? The because would be the support, and the X would be the conclusion. But if that doesn't quite make sense, or you're not sure, then you would want to try it the other way around, right? Why should I believe Y? Because X is true. And if that way makes sense, then that tells you that the X would be the support and the Y would be the conclusion. All right. So sometimes people call this the why because test. Another way to do basically the same kind of test is what some people would call the therefore test. Just order it like this. Say X is true, therefore Y is true. If that makes sense, then that's the structure. But if it doesn't make sense or you're not sure, then reverse it. And does saying Y is true, therefore X, make more sense? Because if so, that's the structure. All right. So we really want to get good at doing that because, they're going to make it difficult for us on a lot of logical reasoning problems. All right. So I want to talk about one more way to help identify conclusions and premises, because this way is actually really at the top of mind for someone who's doing logical reasoning very well. But I want to make sure you recognize that the first two categories here, testing the logical flow, as well as structure indicators, those are actually ways that you prove that something is a conclusion, right? You can logically prove and explain this is why it's a conclusion. This last category about signals of a potential conclusion, they're not actually ways to prove that something is a conclusion. They are ways to get on the scent of what the conclusion might be. All right. So that's why I say there's signals of a potential conclusion. And what are those signals? Well, the first one is statements of author opinion. So author opinion, it includes, quite a few different things. We have judgments. So something is good, right? The Chinese Peruvian restaurant, is, a welcome addition to our neighborhood. Okay, that's my judgment about how good this thing is for our neighborhood. So that's potentially a conclusion, right? A judgment often is a moral judgment as well, right? This is justified. This is not justified. This is acceptable. This is not acceptable. Okay. Recommendations. Oftentimes they're, it's a recommendation because they use the word should. We should go to the restaurant. We should not try any fusion dishes. Those are recommendations. Criticism of another view. That's often a conclusion. When the author rejects another person's view or says that it's flawed, that's very often the conclusion. Proposed explanations. This is also very common. Remember how I talked about sometimes there's another part of the stimulus where it's an observation or fact to be explained. There's more birds flying south this season. Well, if the author proposes why, that's because there's an environmental disaster that affects the skies in the northern hemisphere or wherever these birds are coming from. That potentially is a conclusion, right? Predictions. Those are often conclusions as well. When the author says, I think the new strategy for our widget business will fail. That's a prediction about what's going to happen. Very often a conclusion. How do you actually confirm that these are conclusions if you spot this in the stimulus? Can anyone tell me, how do you actually confirm that it is a conclusion? So you see a judgment. The Chinese Peruvian restaurant is a welcome addition to our neighborhood. If I look at that and I say, it seems like a conclusion, it is a statement of opinion, what am I going to ask to actually prove that it is a conclusion or tell whether it's not? Any ideas? Could it be, yes, it's the why test. I'm going to test the logical flow. Do I get a reason for why this fusion restaurant is a good addition to our neighborhood? Or sometimes you have structure indicators, right? If there was a since in another part of the sentence and then it said since blah, 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 the fusion restaurant is a welcome addition. Okay, now I know that that is a conclusion, but also you'll have to remember it might be an intermediate conclusion, so you'll have to evaluate whether it supports something else, all right? So that's what I mean by signals of a potential conclusion, right? They say, hey, look at this. This might be the conclusion. But you do have to do a little bit more analysis to actually prove it out, all right? Another signal, shifts in tone or direction. So these are the words but and however. Now, when people are learning about these words, I think people give them too much importance because a lot of times people have a tendency to see however or but, and then already thinking that what's about to follow is a conclusion. That often is the case, but it also very often is not the case as well, right? These words just signal a change in the direction of the stimulus. It usually signals where the author's take is going to come in. The first half is like about someone else's take, but now the author's take comes in. But the actual statement that's connected with the but or however could be a premise, could be an intermediate conclusion, and the fact that you have the word but and however, like I said, these are just signals. They don't actually prove that it's a conclusion. So if I ask you, why is that the conclusion? The answer is never going to be because it says however right before it, because it says but right before it, right? If I ask you, why is that the conclusion? The answer is never going to be because that's the author's opinion. I mean, those are signals, but the way you actually prove that it's a conclusion is because of what I was showing earlier, because the logical flow indicates that it's a conclusion, or because structural indicators tell you that it's a conclusion. All right? So any questions about that before we jump into some examples? Feel free to type or unmute yourself if you have questions. No? Okay. Let's go ahead and get started with some examples, and I'll start with a few that I've written myself, maybe 2 or 3, and then we'll jump to like 4 or 5 LSAT problems. So let me start with this. Take a minute or two to read this, and then we'll break it down. Okay, so let's go ahead and break this down. And the way that I want to do this is actually the way that I want you to experience reading a logical reasoning stimulus. And it's the way that I'm trying to approach a logical reasoning stimulus. And that's actually piece by piece. So I'm not going to like read the whole thing, the whole paragraph first, and then start to break it down and do analysis. After every single statement, I'm going to be thinking about its role. All right. So let me go ahead and do a line break wherever there's like a new logically separate part of the stimulus. And let's just start with that first sentence. What's the role of this first sentence? The success of HBO's Game of Thrones has resulted in numerous streaming shows based on popular fantasy series. So if you're thinking maybe it's a conclusion, you have to make sure you ask why, right? How do I know that this has resulted in numerous streaming shows? How do I know that there are a lot of shows coming around because of Game of Thrones? I don't think you have a reason for that, right? And notice the structure is we have other viewpoints coming along that are now talking about this trend of new streaming shows, right? Amazon has Lord of the Rings. There's probably some other stuff, Shannara Chronicles or whatever. This is just background information. This is the thing that we're talking about, all right? So I hope that makes sense. This is something that's true. Now we're getting into some competing viewpoints about it, all right? Now, this next sentence is very long. I'm going to start by breaking it into basically just the whole sentence like this. But should I break this into two? Many TV critics believe these shows will run for many years, given their high production values, epic action scenes, as well as our desire to escape into fantasy storylines to avoid the drudgery of modern life. So, is this whole thing just one part, just playing one role? Or is there more than one role in this sentence? Should I break it in two? What do you guys think? So, we have an opposing opinion, right? What's the opposing viewpoint? What's the viewpoint of the critics? That these shows will run for many years. But do you see this word here, given? What's the significance of that? Given is now telling us that this is the other person's reason for why they think the shows will run for many years. Exactly. So Raina's saying because? Yeah, because is a good replacement. So does that make sense here that within that sentence, you have two different roles? We have the other person's conclusion, really, and let me just write this out here. This is other, I'll use other conclusion. And then right here, this is other person's premise. All right. So let's keep moving. Any questions about this so far? Now we have this line, however. Unless these shows make drastic changes, they will not run for more than a few seasons. Let me break that into, again, I'm going to go the whole sentence. And maybe the whole sentence itself is like one role. We don't have to break everything apart. What do you guys think about the role of this? Unless these shows make drastic changes, they will not run for more than a few seasons. So, is it, I mean, it sounds like an opinion about something. It actually sounds like a rejection, kind of a rejection of the other critic's view. So I'm already thinking probably a conclusion of some kind. Do we get a reason for how we know or why the author thinks they won't run for more than a few seasons unless they change a lot? Because viewership is low and declining, which indicates they lack popular appeal. So does it make sense? We do have some support in this bottom part for the however line. All right. So that right there is telling me this is a conclusion of the author's argument of some kind. I have not yet determined, I mean, we could probably tell it's not an intermediate conclusion because do you see how the rest of this, and we'll break that down in a moment, but the rest of this is like a reason for the however line. So I'm comfortable calling this the author's main conclusion. Okay. So I hope that makes sense. What about down here in this last line? Viewership is low and declining, indicating that, notwithstanding the many positive reviews, these shows lack popular appeal. How many distinct parts are within this last sentence? Is the whole thing just a premise? Is there a premise in something else? Is there a premise in two other things? Okay, so Monica's saying two. And those two parts would be viewership is low and declining. And then would the whole rest of it be? Okay, so there's definitely premise, intermediate, conclusion structure here because viewership is low and declining is indicating that they lack popular appeal. So viewership is low and declining would be a premise. The idea that that shows they lack popular appeal is telling us they lack popular appeal would be a intermediate conclusion, which supports the main conclusion. But don't ignore one more item, right? There's actually 3 separate statements here, or 3 separate roles. So, do you see this part? Notwithstanding the many positive reviews. What is that? It's a concession, right? Because the author's not bringing up the fact that these shows have good reviews to like help prove that they're not going to run for more than a few seasons unless they change. That's like someone might think positive reviews means that they're popular, but actually the author's saying, no, I concede that they have positive reviews. Anyway, they're actually not popular because of the viewership. Okay, so just to make sure this is clear, this is a premise. This part in the middle, notwithstanding, by the way, that phrase notwithstanding, that's often a concession indicator. Concession, I should probably write concede, but I'll write concess. And then finally we have an intermediate or subsidiary conclusion. Okay, so any questions about that? Do you notice how if you go slow and you stop after each sentence, you can start to see and dissect the structure. But where you go wrong is if you get halfway into it and you don't have any thoughts on like, well, this was a other person's view, this was a fact, this is potentially a premise. If you're not thinking about that stuff until you get halfway into it or towards the end, I think it's a lot harder to reconstruct it when you've already just read the whole thing as like one entire block. Yeah, Reina, can you, if you don't mind unmuting yourself, how can we tell that the main conclusion is the main conclusion and not, like, how can we tell that the support goes like this, and does not go the other way around? And if you don't want to talk, that's okay too.
Hi, I do want to talk because I really thought the last sentence was the main conclusion.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to get out of this.
So, yeah, here's our tools, right? So we're going to ask first, why is this however line true? Why does the author think that's true? And then we'll see if it makes sense to say because the last line. And then we'll turn it around. All right. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So let's see. Why does the author think, or let's make it more personal, why should I believe that unless these shows change, they're not going to run for more than a few seasons? They're going to be canceled after a few seasons. Because the shows lack popular appeal. Okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's try it the other way around.
Okay.
Yeah, let's try it the other way around.
Okay.
Can you try it? Yeah.
Let's do that. Why this show lacks popular appeal? Because they don't run for a few seasons. No, I don't know. Because the viewership is declining, that's why.
Yeah, the viewership is supporting lack of popular appeal.
Right.
Lack of popular appeal seems like a reason why it's going to be canceled, right? It doesn't make sense to say, like, unless they change, they're not going to run for more than a few seasons. And therefore, this is why they lack popular appeal. The however line is like a prediction that requires some evidence to support the prediction. But the prediction, it seems a little bit strange for the prediction to then prove something about what is currently happening. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So yeah, and definitely if you have difficulty or you encounter a lot of problems where it's a little bit unclear what the main conclusion is, you can practice that technique that we just did. Take a logical reasoning section, and don't time yourself. Just take a look at the stimuluses and actually do what we just did here, line by line. Can you think about what the meaning of it is? And you'll get better as you do it a lot more.
Thank you.
Right? So any other questions about this one before we move to another example? Okay. Let's try another one. So let me go ahead and by the way, these are written to be pretty complicated examples because I wanted to show, like, you know, the every single role if I could. Go ahead and take a minute to try this. Okay, so this is an interesting one. Hopefully you don't have a supervisor like this, or you are not a supervisor like this, although I suppose it's okay. We do need people who are on top of their employees. I'm going to do what I did last time, and I'm going to go line by line, all right? And I want to just see, can we identify the role of this? So we have the first sentence here. Let me break it down to the sentence level, and then we'll see whether we should split this up. You don't always need to split a sentence, right? Even if there's two parts. Although the status marker next to David's name on our internal chat system is green, he has not responded to my last 3 messages to the system. What's the role of this? Doesn't sound like a conclusion, right? It seems like background. Monica, when you say intermediate conclusion and premise, just talking about the first one, all right? And I think this is really important. If you're going to call something a conclusion, then we should be able to have a reason. Here's how I know that this is true, all right? But this is actually quite difficult, so I do want to get into this structure, or at least it can be confusing. This is background information. It's actually not, I classified more specifically, because do you see how the very next line, what's the supervisor trying to do with the very next sentence? How would you characterize, this is probably because he has not seen the messages yet? That's the supervisor's attempt to do what? Like, why is the supervisor saying that right after pointing out, hey, look, I've chatted this guy, he's green, he's not responding. They're trying to explain why that's true. Here's why I think he's not responding to me. This is probably because he has not seen the messages yet. So do you see how this first sentence here, it's like an observation that the author is trying to explain. It's a fact that is true, and the supervisor in this position of like wondering, fuming, why is this person not responding to me? Oh, I know why. It's because he hasn't seen the messages yet. So I would call this first one, this would be background, and I'm just going to say fact to be explained. Okay? Now, by the way, do you see how, even though there are 2 separate statements there, and you have the word although, right? But although, that's not being used as a concession or anything. What's the point of having this pair of ideas? The status marker is green. He hasn't responded. Together, they're meant to be a little bit confusing, right? Green probably means that he's there or he's present, right? So why isn't he responding? That's what the first sentence is saying. Okay, this is probably because he has not seen the messages yet. How do we know that's the conclusion? How do I know that's the conclusion? And Dai, I see you saying that's the conclusion. Feel free to unmute yourself and tell me why you think that. So we have because below is a support. We do have reasons, right? We'll break it down even more. What's the first reason that we know he probably hasn't seen it? Or at least the supervisor thinks he probably hasn't seen it? Because he hasn't been known to ignore supervisors before. Sounds like a premise, right? Furthermore, if he did see it and he's ignoring us, it's going to threaten his employment. So do you see how that's also another reason why he's probably not ignoring us? So does that make sense, you guys? These two lines here are support. They're helping to explain, here's why the author believes that he hasn't seen the message yet. This part would be a conclusion. These would be premises. Okay. Any questions about that so far? So, how do you know, by the way, that these two are premises? Like, what makes them not intermediate conclusions? Can you think about that? David has never been known to ignore supervisors at the company. Why isn't that an intermediate conclusion here? Well, let's see. Does the author provide a reason? So, some of you are saying it supports the main conclusion. That is true, right? And I'm being really nitpicky here. That does make it support. It does make it support for the main conclusion. How do you know it's not a conclusion itself, though? Right? How do you know it's not an intermediate conclusion? Because it doesn't have proof of its own. If you were to ask this author, wait, how do you know that he's never been known to ignore the supervisors? There's no line that explains, here's why he has never been known to do that. Right? We don't have like a record of his reviews. We don't have gossip about his reputation. It's just told to us. He hasn't been known to do that. And same thing over here with the furthermore. Wait, how do you know that he knows that it would threaten his employment? Right? Maybe he just doesn't know that. Well, the author doesn't provide us a reason, right? Doesn't say, because I know he went to training and we know that he read the employee handbook. We don't have anything like that. So that's how you know these are premises, not intermediate conclusions. Okay. What about this last line? It's a little bit weird. Regardless of the actual reason, I will send someone to make sure he has not had a medical emergency and to confirm that he's not ignoring me. What's the role of this? It's a little bit strange. It is background. It doesn't play any role in this argument, logical role in this argument. You don't really, it's not too common to see this, but I think of it as like an irrelevant aside. An aside being just like some throwaway comment, an add-on that is not really important to the logic of the argument. Okay? Yeah, this last one here, I can only think of a handful of logical reasoning problems that have had something similar to that. But as long as you recognize this is not playing any logical role in what the supervisor is trying to prove to us, then that's what's important. So does that make sense to you guys? This structure, by the way, it's very confusing because, the word because here, it does, in other contexts, indicate a premise, right? Because the word because, like I just said, can mean since. But there is another use of the word because, which is its causal sense, like a causal explanation sense of because. And when that happens, the thing after the because is not necessarily a premise. So because he has not seen the messages yet, that's not being offered to prove anything else. So that's why it's not a premise. What's happening here is when the author is trying to give you their hypothesis for what happened or what explains what happened in the first sentence, that's now very likely to be the conclusion. And we've confirmed that because we have premises for that. Okay? Okay. So, let's go ahead and try, some examples that I have not written.